Welcome to Making Disciples with me, Austin Roberts. We are excited to have you with us today. We're going to be talking about a psalm. And to be specific, we're going to be talking about Psalm 1. And we're going to hear the word of the Lord and see what he has to say to us today through this psalm. I would imagine that each and every one of us throughout the course of our lives spends a lot of time, whether or not we realize it, making decisions. From the very moment we are born until the moment we die, we spend our whole life making decisions. Some are small decisions like, what am I going to eat for breakfast? What time am I going to leave for work? And we have bigger decisions like, what career do I want to go into? What job do I want to take? And then we have huge decisions like, who do I want to marry? And who am I going to follow ultimately, God or somebody else? But we spend our entire lives from beginning to end thinking and making decisions. It is just part of being a human being. We make decisions. A few years ago, I saw a film entitled The Imitation Game. And The Imitation Game is about a gentleman by the name of Alan Turing. And Turing was a very famous code breaker during World War II. He and a few other people were hired by the British government to break one of the Nazi codes that they would use to send messages back and forth to each other. And it was a long and arduous process. It took them a great deal of time to get to the point where they could break this code. And Turing is considered the father of the modern computer. And he built this computer-like device to help them break this code, and they spent hours, days, weeks trying to break it. Trial and error, and they'd try and try again and again. Now, the difficult thing about this code, or this cipher that the Nazis were using, was that every day at midnight, the code itself would reset. So all the progress they had made over the previous 24 hours was almost useless because every day it would reset. So the process, as you can imagine, was very, very difficult. Well, time went on, they continued to try, and they continued to work, and they continued to try to break this code. And finally, after many, many trials and many, many errors, Turing and his team broke the code. Now, in the film, of course, it's dramatized a little bit, but they are obviously incredibly excited that they have finally gotten to the place where they understand where they have broken the code. And in the film, you see that they are beginning to read the messages that the Nazis are sending back and forth to each other. And one of the guys who is there helping break this code reads one of the messages. And in this message, the Nazis say to one another that they are going to sink a certain ship out, I believe, in the Atlantic Ocean or near Great Britain somewhere. And he realizes that his brother is on this ship. And so he has to save the ship. And so he immediately reaches for the phone to call someone to tell them. But as he does so, Turing stops him, and he won't let him call. And you kind of watch and you think, how could he do such a thing? But then he goes on to explain, he says, listen, we can't tell anybody we've broken this code except our immediate superiors. Because if we tell people and we start acting on these messages that we are reading, the Nazis are going to find out that we have broken the code. They're going to change everything, use a new cipher, and then all this work we have done will have been useless. It'll be worthless. We won't be able to do anything with it. And so we kind of sit there and we watch this film and we watch Turing make what must have been a very, very difficult decision not to make a move, not to save a life. Have you ever been in a place where you've had to make a difficult decision like that? To say something or do something, or perhaps not say something or not do something? We've all had tough decisions in our lives. I remember one for me that happened a little while ago. I was a senior in high school, and the time had come to decide where I was going to go to college. Well, I had a good friend by the name of John. We'd grown up together, and we were going to go to the same college, hopefully, and when we got there, we were going to be roommates. So we talked a lot senior year about where we wanted to go, and we had gotten it down really to two places. We either wanted to go to Walla Walla University up in College Place, Washington, or we wanted to go to Southern Adventist University in Collegedale, Tennessee. And we were taking a lot of time to figure out where we wanted to go, and we weren't sure, and we were thinking about it and talking about it. And it was getting toward the end of senior year, sometime in the spring. And we still hadn't decided. Well, we played in this orchestra together at that time. So after orchestra rehearsal one evening, John and I were talking, and I asked him, I said, hey, where are you going to go? And I was kind of hoping he would make this decision so I wouldn't have to go through the trouble of making the decision. And I was really hoping he was going to choose Southern, because that's where I was pretty sure I wanted to go. Well, he wasn't sure, and so he thought about it, and he said that he would get back to me. And so within the next couple of days, he did just that. And we talked, and he said, listen, Austin, I have made a decision. I want to go to Walla Walla University. I would love to have you there as my roommate, but you need to make the decision for yourself. And I said, okay, sounds good. And I told him I'd get back to him. And I thought in that moment, I was like, oh, come on. I really thought we were going to go to Southern together and be roommates and have a good time. And I was disappointed. That's really where I wanted to go. But naturally, I put the decision off even further because I didn't want to take the time to sit down and really make that decision, to go with my very close friend to Walla Walla, or to go to the place where my heart desired the most, to Southern. And so I put it off, and I put it off, and I put it off, and I put it off. And it was getting to the point where I think my parents were getting a little nervous and saying, Austin, you know, you got to make a decision. College is getting closer, and you've got to choose. Well, finally, I thought, okay, I've got to make this decision. I intend to go to school next year, and I just don't know where yet. And so I remember on one day in particular, I went up to my room, and I was thinking about it, and I was praying about it, and I was saying, Lord, make this decision for me. I need to go where you want me to go, not just where I want to go. And so I remember sitting on my bed and praying about it and thinking about it. And finally I said, Lord, I need you to make this decision for me. And then I did something that I would not recommend that you do. And since this time, I have hopefully matured in my spiritual journey. But I took out a coin. And I said, God, I need you to make this decision for me. And I'm going to flip this coin. And if it lands on heads, I will go to Southern. And if it lands on tails, I will go to Walla Walla. And so I prayed once again, and I said, God, make this decision. And then I sat there, and I flipped the coin, and it was in the air for what seemed like minutes, although it was only seconds. And it finally landed on the floor, and I looked, and it said, tails, Walla Walla. And I said, okay, God, 2 out of 3. We got to do this again. And so I flipped it again, and once again, it landed on tails. And I thought, okay, God, I asked you to make this decision for me, so we're going to do this your way. I called John, and I said, John, we're going to go to Walla Walla together. And it wasn't really where I wanted to go, but in hindsight, I praise God for sending me there because it was ultimately the best place for me and the best place for me to learn and to minister to the people around me. We're surrounded by difficult choices every moment, every day. Some carry more weight, some are more lighthearted, but no matter what, we always have choices to make. So I'd like to invite you, if you would like, to open with me to the Psalms. And we're going to go to the very first Psalm, Psalm 1. And we're going to read this Psalm. It is in the genre of wisdom. It's a psalm of wisdom. And so we're going to read what God says in this psalm. And there are 3 stanzas. And in the first couple of stanzas, we see 3 ideas kind of split into these 2 stanzas. So let's read Psalm 1, 1 to 3 together. It says this: "Blessed is the one who does not walk in step with the wicked, or stand in the way that sinners take, or sit in the company of mockers, but whose delight is in the law of the Lord, and who meditates on his law day and night. That person is like a tree planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in season, and whose leaf does not wither. Whatever they do prospers." So like I said a couple of moments ago, this psalm has a few ideas that are important to us about decisions. And like I said, there are 3 ideas split into these first 2 stanzas. And so we're going to look at the first 2 right now, and the third we will come to in a little bit. And the first one is this. This psalm is suggesting that we be people of depth, of true depth. In fact, if you look at the psalm, it talks about depth, and it says a few things. It says, don't walk in step with the wicked. Don't stand in the way that sinners take. And then it says, don't sit in the company of mockers. And so you see this kind of progression here. It says, don't walk with the wicked. Don't stand with the sinners. Don't sit with the mockers. And there's this progression that you see in this psalm of going further and further into sin. And the psalmist writes here and says, no. Don't be like that. Don't take that road. You have a choice, a decision to make. In fact, I remember a time when I was a kid, and I was getting a talking to from my dad, and I don't remember exactly why or what had happened that led to me getting in trouble, although I am sure I deserved it. And he was sitting there, giving me this talking to, and he was saying a few things to me. And the truth is, I don't remember everything he said, but I do remember one thing that has stuck with me and stayed with me throughout my life. He was talking to me and he was saying, "Austin, listen, you can't be doing these things and making these poor decisions because, it starts like this. It starts small, and then the decisions get bigger and bigger and bigger. And one day you'll wake up and you'll realize you are a long way away from where you want to be." And that struck me. And he was talking about, you start here on this path, and it seems almost the same. But one day you wake up, and you will be a long way off to the other side. And that idea has stuck. And it's kind of like what the psalmist is saying here. He's saying, don't go down that road. Don't walk with the wicked. Don't stand with the sinners. Don't sit with the mockers. Don't even bother with those things, because that is not the way we want to go. Don't be that way. And so that is the first idea. Don't go down this path. Be a person of depth. Be a person who won't go down that path, but instead stays in the way of the light, stays in the way of the blessed, and meditates on the law day and night, as the text says. So that's the first thing. The second thing that this stanza talks about is being fruitful. And we can see it here in this text. That person is like a tree planted by streams of water, which yields fruits in its season, and whose leaf does not wither, and whatever they do prospers. Now, I don't know too much about fruit and fruit trees and the like, but I do know this, and that is that most trees, most fruit trees especially, don't yield fruit year-round. There is a specific season you come to when the buds turn to fruit and they grow and they ripen, and then you can pick that fruit and you can eat it, and it's good. And that's exactly what the psalmist is saying here. He's saying, yield fruit in your season. And that's important. And each tree that yields fruit will do that. Like I said, it doesn't yield fruit year-round. It comes in its own season. When I was a kid, our family visited our cousins and aunt and uncle, which at the time was in Washington, D.C. That's where they lived. And we had a good time. My sister and I loved visiting our cousins and hanging out and playing and seeing the sights. And it was an interesting time when we visited. You see, there was a phenomenon going on that doesn't happen very often. You see, there in that area of the United States, they have this bug, this insect. And to be honest with you, I don't like bugs and insects very much, but this one was a little different. You see, this one was called a cicada. And these cicadas only come out once every 16 or 17 years. Now, I remember my aunt explaining to us how the process went. You see, she said, these bugs will lay their eggs, and then the eggs will hatch, and then the nymphs will burrow into the ground about 8 feet deep. And there they will stay. And they will stay there for years, for about 16 or 17 years. And then at that time, they will come back up from the ground, and they'll mate, and they'll lay more eggs, and then the process repeats itself. And they burrow into the ground, and there they stay for years and years on end. And it is a fascinating process. And you think about that, and you think, man, for those cicadas, it is a long time before they see the fruits of their labor. Years. And that is kind of what the psalmist is saying here. He is saying that you may not see the fruits of your labor for many, many years. He's saying that that person that's like a tree planted by streams of water will yield fruit in its season. But for each and every one of us, that could look a little different. That could look like yielding fruit later on today or tomorrow or next week. But for many, your fruit may not yield for months or for years or even for decades. But that's what the psalmist says. Each tree, each person in its season. And the Lord will take care of each and every fruit bearer in their time. And even though it may not seem like we're yielding fruit, even though it might be tough, there might be difficult decisions to make, the fruit will come. We may not even be around to see the fruit that we yield, but it will come if we do what the text says. And what does the text say? Well, it says this: we must meditate on his law day and night. Now, when we think of the ancient Israelites and the land in which they lived, when we hear law in this context, it is written in the Psalms. And so for them, that would have meant specifically the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Torah, the Pentateuch. And so for them, the law was those 5 books. So when the psalmist writes, meditate on his law day and night, what the psalmist is saying to them, to what they would understand, is actually this. He is saying, listen, spend time in the Word. Spend time thinking about that and praying about that and meditating on that Word. And so what this psalmist is saying to us today is that exact same thing. He's saying spend time in this book, in the Word. Read it, pray over it, think about it. Make it a part of your life that is key and that is integral, that is not just on the peripheral, but something that is central to who you are. Meditate on this Word day and night, says the psalmist. That's important. So we've talked about a couple of ideas here. First, the idea of depth and not going down a different path. Second, the idea of being fruitful and understanding that each yields fruit in their own season and that it will look different for each and every one of us. But then we have a third idea. And to get to this third idea, we're going to read the second stanza of this psalm. And that is verses 4 and 5. So let's read what the psalmist has to say here. He says this: "Not so the wicked. They are like chaff that the wind blows away. Therefore the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the assembly of the righteous." There's some interesting things said here in this part of the psalm. And, you know, it's a bit harsh if you think about it. And if any of you work in an industry like marketing or public relations, something that is primarily customer-facing, where you talk to people, you probably understand the importance of positive messaging versus negative messaging. In fact, it's something that I am sure is not only encouraged, but required of many people that work in those industries. And that's basically this. When you talk to a customer, a client, someone who is coming to take part in whatever business you're in, you want to say positive things. So instead of saying something like, "What's the problem?" to somebody, you say instead, "How can I help you?" Instead of saying something like, "Oh, that's wrong, you shouldn't have done it this way or that way," you would instead say, "Well, have you considered trying this approach or that approach?" You know, it's important to have that positive messaging with other people. But the psalmist does the opposite in this psalm. He's harsh. He says, "Not so the wicked. You know, therefore the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor the sinners in the assembly of the righteous." It's not very positive messaging. It's negative, it's harsh, and it kind of has a little bit of a punch. The psalmist here is trying to make a point. And so the point he's trying to make here, this third point, is about stability. He wants us to be people who are stable, who are solid in the word. And he uses an example, an illustration perhaps, that we are not particularly familiar with in this time. You see, I am not, and I would guess most of you are not, farmers. And we don't spend a lot of time out there on the farm doing farm tasks and planting crops and harvesting them and so forth. Most people these days aren't in that industry. But there are a few that are. And so I did some research on farming and did a bit of research on the specific example the psalmist uses here. And so let's look at that example and see what he says. It's very short, but once again in verse 4, the psalmist says this, "Not so the wicked, they are like chaff that the wind blows away." And so the question inevitably arises, what does that mean? Like chaff that the wind blows away. So first, what is chaff? Well, chaff is the outer part of a seed, the husk, that is light. And once you break it off the seed, it's very light and it can just blow away. And chaff really is not useful. It cannot be digested. It really does nothing. It protects the seed as it grows, but then it doesn't do anything after that. Like I said, it can't be digested. It's not good to put in food. It's really useless in many ways. Now, the chaff comes with the seed, obviously, and there is a process that farmers use to separate that. And it's a two-part process. First, they have what is called threshing. And so we get all these seeds and all these things together, and they are pounded and broken apart. And so that way they are separated, sort of. And see, once they are threshed, you have all the seeds and all the chaff that are separate, but they are still all in one big pile. And they're still not 100% separated. It can't be used yet. And so then we have the second part of the process, and that is called winnowing. And so what will happen then is that big pile will be taken, and it will essentially be poured out, and then a light breeze will be blown through all that stuff. And what will happen then is the breeze is just barely heavy enough to blow the chaff away, but not a hard enough breeze so that the seeds themselves will be blown away. And so the seeds of the grain will fall to the ground and the chaff will be blown away. And once again, the chaff is useless. It can't be used for anything. It can't be digested. It can't be put in food. There's nothing that chaff can do. And so that's the example the psalmist uses here. You don't want to be like the chaff on the threshing floor, that once that light breeze comes through, you're just blown away. Instead, you want to be the seed. You want to be stable. You want to have, some weight to you. And you want to be firm in that word. And that's the example the psalmist uses here. You want to be people of stability. And so I guess I would ask you the question, which part of this describes you? Are you like the seed? Or are you like the chaff? And I can't tell you the answer to that. You have to answer that question for yourself. So here we've had 3 ideas, 3 things that the psalmist has talked about. First, you want to be a person of depth. You want to be going down the right path. You want to be making good choices. You don't want to be sitting with the sinners and the mockers. You want to have nothing to do with that. Secondly, you want to be a fruitful person. And understand that being a fruitful person doesn't necessarily mean you will see the fruits of your labor immediately. It could take time. Thirdly, and finally, you want to be a stable person. You want to have stability to you. You don't just want to be blown away with the chaff. And so those are the 3 ideas that are presented here in these 2 stanzas. And so we come to the 3rd stanza. It's only 1 verse, but it's the 6th verse and the final one, and it says this: "For the Lord watches over the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked leads to destruction." And I guess this 3rd and final verse really leaves us with a choice. It talks about 2 paths. It talks about them briefly. So once again, "For the Lord watches over the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked leads to destruction." So you have a choice, as the text says. You can go down with the righteous, and you can go down that path, or you can go down the path with the wicked. And it even tells you what the outcome is. We know what the outcome of going the way of the righteous is, and being with God, with the Lord. And it tells us there that the way of the wicked leads to destruction. And I can't tell you which path to take. I can't make you take one path or the other. But I can tell you this, and that is that you have a choice. You have these 2 paths laid out in front of you, and this is an important choice. You know, each of us in our lives have many decisions we must make, some small, some medium, some very big decisions. Some decisions are like, well, what am I going to eat for breakfast? Other decisions are like, well, which school am I going to go to? What career will I take? And some decisions are like, who will I marry? Whom will I follow? Will it be the Lord or will it be somebody else? But we have the choice laid out here in front of us. And each and every one of you has to make that choice. And I can't tell you which one it's going to be, but I can tell you you have the choice to make. So I ask you today, what's it going to be? Which path are you going to take? Thank you so much for joining us today on Making Disciples. We will see you next time.